very happy to start this event, our human rights conversation on neurotechnology and human rights. Welcome to the speakers, welcome to all of you to this discussion. Our conversations are a format where we really try to, well, have a conversation, have a talk with each other in a rather small format to really be able to dive deep into the topics at hand, especially if it's difficult topics, complicated topics, which this one I think happens to be one. Human rights conversations pick up topical issues and we try to discuss them obviously from a human rights angle as we're the human rights platform here, but also going beyond looking into other fields of science, other fields of research of how actually this field can develop, how policy can be developed in the field. It's a pleasure to have this human rights conversation today in cooperation with GESTA, the Geneva Science and Diplomacy Anticipator. The human rights conversations are a format of the Geneva Academy's human rights platform, but we also try to team up with experts in the relevant fields. So of course it was with great pleasure that we heard that GESTA would accept to cooperate in this event. So welcome to colleagues here for this cooperation. As I say, it's a small event, nevertheless it's a public event, and this is also why you see the event is being recorded. We have made the choice not to have an online audience to really have a discussion here in the room and not feel we have to scream sometimes at a screen, because you still tend to have a different kind of conversation with audience online. Nevertheless, the event is videotaped to be put later on our YouTube channel, so it could be seen also and listened to by people who were not able to join us here this morning. A beautiful morning, by the way. You see a place here at the lake, so thank you for sitting inside with us. We could next time maybe also think about doing walking groups in the park with this summer weather, but I hope it will not get too hot in the room for this morning's discussion. So, as with any technical innovation, neurotechnologies come with both premises and dangers for the realization of human rights. The more innovative a technology is, the more groundbreaking, the higher are the stakes. The UN Secretary General asks in his 21 report, Our Common Agenda, to prevent harms in the digital or technology spaces, including in neurotechnology, I'm quoting. But what does that actually mean concretely? Neuroscience shows great potential in the medical domain, so also towards the realization of, for example, the right to health. But the scope of the political potential negative impacts of other rights are still quite unknown. This quest is guiding the current study by the Advisory Committee of the United Nations Human Rights Council, mandated in a Human Rights Council resolution on neurotechnology and human rights, and we'll hear much more from that on that from the persons involved. But as a backdrop also, I was just reading yesterday a piece that was published in the MIT Technology Review 2 weeks ago, which in short asks whether it's a human rights violation to remove a brain implant against the will of a person. And this is not about bodily integrity, but it is about altering the person who had become one with her device and so was objecting to that test device being taken off again. That was in medical use, but so we see actually there's quite a big area of topics that can be addressed from a human rights perspective in the debate today. And so I'm very happy that I'm joined by an excellent panel here. First, to start with Her Excellency Claudia Fuentes, Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Chile to the UN in Geneva. And of course, here in both the national capacity, I would say, we come to that in the discussion, but also in your role in the Human Rights Council resolution. Milena Costas-Trascasas is a chairperson of the UN Human Rights Council Advisory Committee, but not only here for that, but because she in particular is the rapporteur of the study of the Advisory Committee on Neurotechnology. Gerard Escher is senior advisor to the GESTA board and formerly was senior advisor to the rector of EPFL, the École Polytechnique Fédérale in Lausanne, the technical university. And so is here also as a representative of our partner organization, GESTA. Jonathan Andrew then is an independent researcher, but also a former colleague here at the Geneva Academy, where he did research on topics around technology and human rights. And this is also something we'll get started with, actually, Because speaking about neurotechnology and the impact on human rights, there is a lot of terms that immediately come afloat. There is discussions that are all linked, but still different and sometimes blurry, of big data, of digitalization. And so, Jonathan, if we would start maybe with you, if you could just define some of the terms for our discussion today to see where neurotechnology is sitting in that conglomerate of terminology, and also where the discussions might need to link up with other technological terms, but where it might also be useful to take things piece by piece.
Thanks very much, Felix, and it's a pleasure to join you here at the Villa this morning. I think, Felix, you touched on one of the key points, one of the key quandaries or problems that I think we're facing in terms of looking at new and emerging digital technologies. And I heard one of my colleagues this morning mentioning some of the discussions seeming to cover everything at once, and then not necessarily covering things, looking at issues in sufficient depth. And one of the challenges, I think, with technologies, particularly as we see technologies moving forward at such a rapid pace, is we tend to conflate different topics. So I think it's important when we're looking at neurotechnologies, really, and in terms of definitions, depending on different perspectives, we see different terms, different definitions being used. But just to keep it simple, I see, two broad categories of technology in terms of neurotechnologies and how they're being used. We can see neurotechnologies in terms of the insights and furthering understanding that we have of the functioning of the brain and nervous system through observation, through monitoring, for example. So, for instance, I'd cite functional magnetic resonance imaging as a way of understanding better the functioning of the brain through monitoring blood flow. This is a technology which is being used not just in humans, but I've just recently been following developments in marine biology, and they're actually using magnetic resonance imaging to look at the functioning of dolphins and determine the level of cognitive abilities of different species. So it just shows you, how technology is being used in different spheres. And I think it's important that we consider when we talk of digital rights, which is a term that's increasingly being used, we actually look across the broad spectrum of different interdependent and rights that are being engaged. I think the intersection of different human rights is a key issue here in terms of looking at neurotechnologies. The second category that I would broadly observe is one of neurotechnologies being technologies that modify or alter, interact with the activities of the brain and nervous system. So different from a monitoring or observational perspective, actually altering or engaging with the functioning of the brain and nervous system. So we've seen advances in recent years in, for example, the connectivity interfaces between the brain and devices. I'm thinking here of prosthetic devices. There's some amazing work being done here. I think particularly of ETH in Zurich and EPFL in robotics in terms of this interface and using the electrical impulses from the brain to drive and improve the motor ability of persons with limited mobility issues. So briefly, there are two categories of neurotechnologies that we can think of in this discussion. I think in terms of other technologies that intersect, we have artificial intelligence, which may or may not be part of the technology that's being developed in particular instances. We have machine learning, we have issues also concerning the use of big data, the storage of personal data relating to health data, also different categories, sensitive categories of data, biometrics. And when we begin to look at the cognitive aspect, then I think we have a very interesting discussion around, if we look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the premise of human dignity, we're beginning to engage aspects of our autonomy and our independence, aspects of our own private seclusion, what it is to be an individual, what it is to form our own thoughts. So we can also look under the UDHR to, for example, Article 18, freedom of thought, and religion and conscience. We can also look to freedom of expression, which may or may not be engaged in terms of how one expresses ourselves and whether there's any sort of chilling effect in terms of the monitoring of our activity, of our brain activity and thoughts. And then, of course, we have Article 25 and the right to health. And I was just thinking prior to this discussion, I think it would be very interesting, given the context, if we look forward. This is one of the points I briefly just wish to touch on. If we think of demographics and we think of the aging population, where will we be in 20 or 30 years' time? If you imagine yourselves in 30 years, I've just been working on Saturday, I was working with young people with cognitive disabilities and physical disabilities, and I was also working with elderly people in their 90s with dementia. And so we had an age gap of around 80 years between the youngest and the oldest. And it was quite fascinating to think of neurotechnologies in that context in terms of what it means for different parts of the population. And just in terms of, for example, I haven't mentioned the various treaties that come into play when we look at Neurotechnologies, but if we think of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, that came into being in 2006. I started my studies of law in 2007. It wasn't actually in force into 2008, and that really shows you relative to other treaties the kind of gap in time in terms of that oversight in terms of ensuring there was a treaty in place to guarantee the rights of persons with disabilities. So I think I'll finish there. Hopefully we'll have a bit of an opportunity, I think, to touch on some of the key areas around privacy and data protection, which is my area of specialization.
Thank you very much, and indeed we will touch upon other topics, and you'll have the possibility also to come back in the discussion, but I should have said this at the beginning. We of course will have first a guided discussion here at the podium, but then really also open the floor to have that discussion among all of us. But if I can turn to you now, Ambassador Fuentes, hearing about the state of art in technology and also the impacts, the links to the different articles, also, Jonathan already mentioned the term of neural rights. So could you give us some insights into the deliberations that prompted Chile's national legislation on neural rights? Chile is among the first ones to address this in national legislation. So how did that come about?
Thank you so much, Felix, for the invitation. We have been together in several different settings discussing about a variety of issues regarding human rights. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you this morning. So before talking a little bit about this Chile, the specificities of what's going on, what we have been doing in my country, let me a little bit of background and how this, in terms of how this came into being. So as you know, technological advancements have profound implications for human rights. In the way we understand human rights and also the kind of normative frameworks that we need to have in place in order to respond to these new challenges. So here we are not talking about legal reforms, constitutional reforms, which is what actually happened in Chile, but I believe this is a wider discussion on the human rights challenges of the use and consequences of these technologies. In the current framework of the universal human rights system, the regulation of scientific and technological research is dealt with in a very dispersed manner and in a way indicative manner. None of the international human rights instruments analyzes the applied effects that science can have on physical and mental integrity and how it could impact on different rights, for example, the rights to life or the right of health that Dr. Jonathan had mentioned recently. So actually, the most specific and comprehensive reference is found in 1948, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which states in Article 27 that the right of everyone to participate in and benefit from scientific progress and to be protected from the misuse of science. But here we're talking about 1948. And as you know, of course, there have been a wide range of scientific developments. So here what I want to emphasize is that existing treaties human rights treaties is what I'm talking about, cannot offer the protection that we need when we are dealing with this issue of neurotechnological world that we are talking about these days. This is precisely the gap that I think in Chile found. So there is an international normative gap when dealing with the effects of technology in human rights, and particularly the effect of neurotechnologies. And we also, of course, we also have a domestic legal gap. We didn't have any normative, domestic or constitutional legal norms basically helping us to understand or how to deal with these issues. So starting from that, from this international gap, Chile started a conversation in early 2019, which ended towards the end of 2021. My country became the first nation in the world to have a constitution in force that explicitly addresses the challenges of emerging neurotechnologies. The modification of the Constitution, in my view, could be seen as an important historical event, given that emerging neurotechnologies have the potential to gather data from our brains, as it was explained before, or even to manipulate them, thereby influencing what we think or what we do. The Chilean Constitution, as it now stands, requires that technological developments respect people's physical and mental integrity, and it states that the law must specifically protect brain activity and information related to it. The aim, and this is important to also highlight, is to discourage technological innovation or neuroscientific research. Is not, to discourage this innovation. We believe that this is important, but at the same time to ensure that these are carried out with full respect for fundamental rights, and that the population is adequately informed about the effects, the risks, and also, of course, the benefits. It is important to underscore, maybe some of you know, that we are currently undergoing building a new constitution in my country. This has been a process that has been going on for a couple of years. This is at least the second attempt, I would say the third attempt, that we're actually doing that. We believe, hopefully, that in this new attempt, also, all this discussion about neurotechnology will be, and the effects on that on our citizens and the human dignity of people will be also in this new constitution. That's the expectation. At the same time, we're currently discussing a more specific law on neuro rights, but it's a discussion that is currently in the Senate. It's an ongoing discussion. And to end, let me talk a little bit about how this is possible. I think that probably the question that had been placed for me is why Chile was the first country actually to have this discussion, which is something that when I arrived here I didn't know. So I did a little bit of research in terms of what happened, and this is a typical question in political science, why this particular law came into being, while other subjects we don't take them into consideration. I think in the case of Chile, there are several factors that that help to explain that. First is the fact that in our Senate we have a commission that is called the Commission on Challenges for the Future, Science, Technology, and Innovation, which is a body with the objective of legislating and thinking in political and legal terms about the emerging issues that will shape the future of our society. So we have this commission in place. The objective, as I said, is to introduce legislation arising from the advancements of science and issues related to medicine. So there is a particular commission within our Senate discussing, this broad array of issues related to technology. Second, in my view, this legislation and this change in the Constitution was possible because of the work between these policymakers in the Senate and epistemic communities. This was done, among other things, because there was extensive work developed between universities, think tanks, and foundations. So The constitutional year changes was possible also, among other things, because we work very closely with the Neuroscience Foundation, which is a foundation based in Columbia University, which helped us in order to understand, the link between neuroscience and changes and the consequences for human being. Chilean University, the Universidad Católica, worked very closely with this as well, and of course, a support from the Ministry of Science. So my point here, and I think it's something that we can discuss further in terms of the works of the Human Rights Council and other international institutions, how to move further. I think the key is a combination of policymakers that believe that this is something that we need to, that needs real discussion and consideration, that is something that requires a policy change, and at the same time a hand-in-hand work with universities and think tanks, because these issues are really difficult to understand for the majority of people actually doing policies. So we need to work very closely with people that work with science and scientists. And I believe that it was that combination that made the law possible in the case of Chile.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for those insights, Ambassador Fuentes. And actually, well, you mentioned also that your aim is there to not disencourage technical developments, but actually to give a regulatory frame, because I think also one thing we could discuss later, I think there's also sometimes calls for moratoria on technical development, which I guess in the very rare cases work actually. So also your approach might be a very interesting one. And you mentioned also, I'm very happy to hear that the science policy cooperation that actually led to the processes in Chile. And that is a very nice way to lead over to our next speaker, Gerard Escher from GESDA, because you have it already in the name kind of your organization, the Science and Diplomacy Anticipator, so that cooperation, that interlinkage between science and policy is very much in what you're doing. But to explain what you're actually doing at GESDA is the first thing that I'd like to turn to you, because I think in Geneva we all know GESDA, but not everybody necessarily knows what are you doing. Maybe it's because your time horizon is quite encouraging and stretched also, so maybe some words on that from your side, Gerard.
There are people in the room who will explain you better than I can what GESDA in general is doing. What are we doing for neurotechnology? First, we get excited. We get excited about the technology. And then we get critically excited. As the ambassador said, science as a human right has to be beneficial. And that's the critical aspect. So make sure that this exciting thing is beneficial to people, to humanity. We are lucky that neurotechnology has public definitions. Andrew presented a slightly different one. It's not a fight, it's not an epistemic fight. It's the problem on how far we integrate the digital revolution in neurotechnology, because you can, of course, ChatGPT can immediately become the main focus of neurotechnology if you want. But this is the definition we use. We have a little paper for those who want to read more, but that's the thing. The excitement of science comes by little bits in papers. I'll give you 3 examples. This is 3 recent examples. This one from May. The title is worth what it's worth. No one has an idea of but there's a non-invasive brain recording. So functional MRI, the stuff you have in hospitals, can be used to reconstruct language from people today. And that's how it works. The machine, so the consenting adult is in a tunnel, so it's not something that works through cameras in the streets. The consenting adult is in a tunnel, and it is presented with a text. That's the stimulus. So the person hears that text, and the machine gets the signals from the brain. And then, through another process, and you see here, proposed continuations. That sounds like ChatGPT. So that's a generative, it's a transformer. It's a generative pre-trained transformer, but used this time in the clinic. And then the machine proposes the thought of that guy. And you see that between the actual stimulus and the decoded stimulus by the machine, there's differences. It's not that you have a very precise knowledge. So there is no air mattress, there is no, dark. So, but it's about the same. It's window, dark, and so forth. So that's what we can do today with $1 million machine in a hospital, training someone for 20 hours listening to text so that the transformer can learn how the signals are disposed. It's not very precise, but it works. And with machines that we have today, they cost 1 million, so it's not a problem that you would have them sneaked into your thing. Maybe I skip the others not to be too long. This one has been announced by Felix. So it's a breakthrough for handicapped, for paralyzed people. Also, what is new is the 2 ears that person Gert-Jan has on the head, because that's where the smartness now is. It's this combination, like before, between machine learning and electrodes on the brain. So this one is invasive. Well, both are invasive because when you are in a tunnel, you sort of feel invaded by the whole machine, but in the MRI tunnel. But this one is really fixed on your skull, on your brain, sorry, it's through the skull. And it's the same thing. What they achieved is by training that poor guy for months and months, the machine, through machine learning, you can separate what the brain is doing for leg movements and what it's doing for everything else, because the brain is doing a lot of stuff all the time. So you have to separate. So now this guy can walk without thinking of walking because the computer does it for him. And he can sing or chew gum or whatever at the same time than he's walking. So that's a breakthrough. Third breakthrough, the word here, again, it comes by little bits in the scientific literature, cortical organoids. With the stem cell technology, now we can start to grow brain-like stuff in dishes in the lab. They're very small, 1 millimeter, 2 millimeter. But if you put that little thing growing from human stem cells into a rat, it will be happy in the rat brain. And today we have already animals whose about 20% of their brain is human. The rest is a rat. And through a manipulation, I'm not going into details, we can prove that the human neurons that come from this little culture, this organoid, are actually active. They do stuff for the rat. No brilliance, no rat is yet at Harvard, so that's how we get excited, and we write about it every year in a book called The Radar, which lots of things, collective intelligence, augmented reality, biological computing, brain-inspired computing, and so forth, cognitive enhancement, and so forth, which we are this excitement, we ask the scientists to say, if we do now the anticipation, which is our work, then we get these things which become interesting for regulators, but also for the population in general. What the scientists say will be there in 25 years, which gives us time to do the right thing so that we don't lose the technology, because it will help a lot of people, it will be good, but so that we don't do bad stuff, that we don't do harm. And you see here, for instance, the 25-year in memory modification is an interesting case for Andrew, because scientists predict that there will be a seamless integration between what your implant knows and what you know. You will no longer be able to tell apart, because you will not know if the thing you know about Napoleon comes from the Wikipedia that you have behind your ear, or you really learned it somewhere. Okay, so we have 25 years, but it's an interesting case. So what is needed, we think, is a navigation tool. A navigation tool which has several parts, and we still work on it, we will work on it with a coalition and so forth, but we have to update the science, stick to the science, because otherwise we are always in phantasmas. We always manipulate. It's possible, but be precise, be precise. We have to anticipate what we will use the technology for. It's not easy. There's military, there's customer, general for general people, and there's the clinical use, which will be the first one always to come forward, and which we should not. Then the impacts, and that's where people here on the table work on. It's what is the impact on the human rights frame. But it's not just dignity or integrity, but it's also equality, solidarity, justice, you know, all these things also. Access has to be also there, not, you know, safety, of course, but we have to know the norms, and there's a lot of the legal framework, let's say, and it goes from the Universal Declaration to regional pacts that already exist, to constitutions or law like were presented, and to soft law, which is, so this is also very evolving, and we should use these tools and make these tools known for these use cases. And then we have to listen to the communities of practice, of course. All this together in a space, people should come together. This maybe today is one example, but we have to structure this space to make it enforceable, to make something with consequences. Call for action. The first action for us is to make responsible innovation. When you build the stuff, and we have 25 years anticipation, build it right. Build it in a way that we can control it, you know, do it right. Once you have something on the market, it's more complicated to change, but do it right. So self-regulation or responsible innovation by scientists is something we now will look to very, very hard, so that the benefit by design is coming, and so forth. So, and it goes down to building capacity so that people in all countries can use neurotechnologies, can say something about neurotechnologies, not just buy stuff and stick it into the brain, but really capacity building, campaigns, education, all this is as urgent as regulations here and there.
Thank you very much, Gerard. And actually, it is very exciting to hear what you're doing. And so it's for a reason we all know about Gesta, and it's very exciting to hear what Gesta is doing, because really this perspective of looking ahead, what will happen, because I mean, you say we still have 25 years, but on the other hand, we see also at your examples how quickly technology is evolving. I think that question of the evolving regulation will be very important in our fields. And that is also one area that you, Milena, are addressing. So the advisory committee is the think tank of the Human Rights Council, a group of independent experts mandated to think on different topics, produce studies that later will be taken up by the Human Rights Council in other discussions, in other resolutions. Also, you need resolutions to be asked to do a study. So, as I said, you're the chairperson of this advisory committee, but you're the rapporteur for that specific topic. Lots of studies have been done by the advisory committee, be it on corruption, on right to development, on climate change, on technology. But I think you're into a very specific one, also by the reach that you need and by the breadth and wealth of information you'll need to digest. But so could you maybe first tell us how we even got to the Council having then a resolution, and we'll come to that resolution specifically, but what preceded actually the current mandate?
As you mentioned in the presentation, the Advisory Committee has received a mandate from the Human Rights Council, and for all that want to consult the resolution is Resolution 51/3. It was adopted by consensus by the Council the 6th of October past year. The negotiation process, as you asked me to explain a little bit on the background where this comes from, it was led principally by Greece. We have the representative of Greece here in the room with the support of a core group of states, which was Chile, of course, because of the national legislation and all the background they have at the national level. We had also Singapore, and there was also Switzerland that joined this core group at the latest point. The initiative was sponsored by a total of 50 states, and the greater part of which were from the Western European and other members, and also from the GRULAC. So we have very clear support from these two regional groups. The mandate, as you mentioned, we are a body made up of 18 independent experts, so we are independent, we work pro bono, so we don't have any kind of conflict of interest while working in our reports. As you mentioned, we provide research-based advice to the Council, so we work at the direction of the Council. And normally, as you mentioned as well, we need a resolution of the Council asking us to produce a report. In this case, I would say that it was quite unusual, the procedure as we get this resolution, because the initiative came in first place from the advisory committee. So it was a member, myself in particular, who had the idea to propose this topic to the advisory committee, and they were super interested, and they said this is the kind of topic the council should be working on, and so that's how the process started. How I got this idea? I mean, the idea was in a very simple manner. I'm very keen on explaining because I was just reading an article at the Spanish newspaper that was really appealing for me, I mean, like a human rights lawyer or expert, because the title of this article was we need a new universal declaration on neural rights. So I was like, okay, this drew absolutely my attention, and after reading this article, I was absolutely, I mean, interested in reading more and knowing more, and I found it really fascinating the topic. I don't know, maybe we will speak afterwards on the questionnaire, but just to say that we are in this process of getting inputs.
Great, thank you so much. And well, you didn't mention the newspaper, the brand. Actually, it would have been quite some publicity for them, seeing that their article generated such a process then eventually in the Human Rights Council. So thank you for showing that background, and that also brings me to you again, Claudia. As was just mentioned with Singapore, Greece, and Switzerland, you're in that core group, and of course you translate national policies also into international action. I think that's quite laudable, coherent policy action. But if you could say also some words again on that resolution, the intentions of the resolution, and where you see that topic then going in the Human Rights Council debate, because I think we've heard like the technological debate going on all that side. You spoke before also of this question of not disencouraging technological advance, but regulation. So where would you see the role of the Human Rights Council in that?
Thank you, and let me also highlight once again that the pen holder of this resolution has been Greece. We have been working together hand by hand in order to get this resolution done, and the objective is to have this report in the 56th session of the Human Rights Council. You have a little bit of time still to present the report. Our expectation basically was, and this is why in the end we decided to present a resolution asking for a report, was to initiate some sort of dialogue and debate within the Council. So to better understand what are the challenges of these new technologies and also the consequences in terms of for human rights standard setting, and ethical discussions that we need to have in the context of the Human Rights Council. As Chile is a new member of the Human Rights Council, we believe that many new issues that I think the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights call it the frontier of human rights. I think we are not even in the frontier anymore. These are right here in our house these days. So it's, I think we shouldn't stop calling them the frontier because we went beyond the frontier anyway. But unfortunately, in the Council, we discuss, as you know, so many different issues, country resolutions and issues related to right to health and other rights. But we have a very limited discussion when it comes to issues related to science and technology and its implications for human rights standards. In the case of Chile, we believe that this is the new discussions that we need to be having because, as I said, of the implications, and that was basically our purpose in terms of promoting this resolution, basically to generate some much needed dialogue on this issue and maybe later on work on a more specific resolution, probably regulating these issues. But the main step, and as you know, the Council has many steps in terms of having different resolutions in place, was to have a report that gives us some important insights, which actually policymakers can use in terms of basically start thinking about these new challenges. Also, let me say that we believe that this resolution and the report will be interactive with our resolutions. For example, you might know that in the next Council will be a specific resolution on human rights and new technologies that will be discussed now in the section that is coming in 2 weeks. So I think that will be, an opportunity, to discuss in interaction with other resolutions on this subject. There are also many other international institutions already working on this. So UNESCO has done an important work, has an interesting report on this issue. There has been also in place, the Organization of American States has been discussing also about neurotechnologies. So I think the work in the Human Rights Council will also interact with the work of other international institutions that are trying to debate, dialogue, and maybe also starting to regulate these issues as well. What else can I say? I think just two things before Felix has stopped me. I think there are two things that I want to stress. One is the issue that Gerard also mentioned. I think in the debate, of course, it's important the issues related to right to privacy and the dignity of each human being. But I think the issue of access, and to make sure that this technology everyone has access to them, because here we're talking about Alzheimer's disease. Here we're talking about the major political, major scientific advancement that will affect the health of human beings around the world. So I would place access as also, and justice and equity as a main principles of debate when dealing with human rights issues as well. And I don't think we should put that at the center. And second, related to also what Gerard said about navigation tool, I have been discussing with different ambassadors here in Geneva related to technology and human rights. And we do need a navigation tool because, of course, all the different missions here, this is difficult to deal with. Mm-hmm. So we need to, we need to read new technological advances on issues that we are not necessarily prepared in terms of our expertise and knowledge. And it's hard to read also because you're reading in 10 years' times, 20 years' time, 50 years' times, that we need to read towards the future here. So once again, this issue of having better navigation tools in coordination with politicians or with the governments are critical here. And I think this is something that we need to also put at the center of our discussions as well.
Excellent, thank you. And I see, Ambassador, that we're getting also to quite concrete outcome points for the discussion. And I like your mention of your relativization of what a frontier issue is, because I always, when hearing discussions, including on child rights or climate change, of speaking of issues or rights of future generations, I think, no, it's right here, it's right now, and especially the work in the Council has to be anticipatory. You say yourself the processes take a lot of time, so sometimes technical development is faster here than regulation, definitely. But so to be also technical in our terms, actually, Milena, as organizations or people also working with human rights mechanisms, could you say some more words on this specific project and the questionnaire you're putting out? Because I would hope that this meeting could also help, again, in engage for more input to your questionnaire. So what are the most important issues that you're reaching out? I saw the questionnaire, it's quite long actually. Also, what impacts are you mostly interested in to hear about? What will best inform your work in the advisory committee?
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, Felix. Yes, in the advisory committee, we are in the process. We had made out a drafting group, and we are in the process of getting inputs from all stakeholders, including the states. And as you mentioned, we have produced a questionnaire, which is in the website, so you can look for it and see how the questions look like. I mean, all questions are equally important. For us, it's a long questionnaire, so I don't want stakeholders be scared, because I know they are overwhelmed with all the work. So we prepare the questions looking forward, having very substantive responses. So we want that those who have knowledge, who have been working in the issue, who have been dealing with impacts, challenges, etc., respond to this questionnaire. And so we made it like open choose and pick questionnaire. So you can choose those questions you think you can respond better. As you say, we made a kind of core of general questions that were mainly addressed to states and other relevant stakeholders, and then several different set of questions which are specifically addressed to other stakeholders like private actors, other entities such as medical and technical communities, and also relevant international organizations, civil society, and UN agencies. So we have these two set of questions. And I think a particular thing is that since we, as the ambassador mentioned, we are looking at what's have been done already, what kind of standards we have already, even if they are dispersed in different frameworks, in different bodies. We wanted to ask the UN system, UN mechanism, what they have been done or what kind of standards can be used or transposed to this area. So that's why we have also ask for inputs to different mechanisms, to special rapporteurs, public special procedures, also to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and also to treaty bodies. So all these answers will be posted also in the website of the advisory committee dedicated to this report, and I think also that's important for everyone have the opportunity to look to these answers. So that's the main point. You can see, for example, we asked, to put an example, describe the work done in relation with neurotechnologies, identify the gaps in governance in relation to neurotechnologies, or also, for example, provide information on national legislation on privacy and data protection, and we ask whether that legislation would cover mental privacy and brain data. So we are not specifically addressing this question to governments, but also they can, civil society, for example, can also answer to these questions.
Thank you, and so Gerard, to come over to you again. I don't know if Jesta is planning to do a submission to this questionnaire, but in any case, if you could let us know also, what gaps did you detect in regulation policy, maybe with your radar, and how can, for example, the navigation tool also help the states to focus their discussions in the Human Rights Council, in our specific field actually, on further development of any such regulation?
I'm still bathing in sunlight with what the ambassador said, that we need a navigation tool, and we should build it with the states. You know, we should build it maybe with the willing states. You know, maybe we have to be innovative. That's not, you know, before we get China and the US at the same table. Maybe let's do it with Chile, and you know, go ahead. But this is really something, that this structured navigation tool that states can like and can use. You know, that they are. That for me is, I'm just bathing in there, and that's what Jesta might contribute to do soon. Now the gaps, again, if you look at the technologies, you know, that emerge. Today we have, in only one country in the world, and it's not, we have monkeys with human cells. So we have chimeras of human monkey brains, human, non-human primate, to be precise, brains. Should we do that? You know, should we do that? So there is no process today to be quick enough, you know, to be quick and say, we as humanity will not do this. We will not go into this research of chimeric human ape brains. And they are already, the 2 or 3 apes that exist, they're already not bad. I mean, they're good. I mean, they're not at Harvard like the rats, but so these are the gaps. I think we don't have, this is one gap. So there's no quick, you know, you mentioned Asilomar, and so there's no really interconnection between what scientists should do, critically thinking, not just the lab scientists, but the social scientists, the epistemic communities, as was said before. I like this idea, but also connected with all the other communities of practice, you know. So, and there's no fun. So that's for me the gap, the real gap. So it's not, it's less today. I mean today, and we have in our task force the people who invented, who created the neuro rights movement. They are in our task force. So it's not against this, but I think we have these specific gaps on how to build the process to be fast enough. You know, the gap is we don't have a good process recognized by states, recognized by the scientists. For me, the values, again, things should work. You know, the first value of a technology, it should work. You know, That's the responsibility that of scientists, but also of the society. But then we can see that we should build in staff. We have heard. So guaranteed access, reversible, it should be reversible. It should be, you should be strong consent. Today we have consent in medicine, but for the numerical digital world, we don't know exactly what consent could mean. So we have to work on this. What are you consenting to? And you should know what you're consenting to. We are lucky today, and for the next 10 years, I'm sure it's that, these things only work if the patient or the subject is strongly consenting. For instance, the thing I gave you with decoding thoughts, if that person who is in the machine and the machine learning tries to decode what his thoughts are, if that person starts to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it's finished. And if you put another person in there, it's nothing, because we don't know the code of the brain. Today we cannot say this movement means sun and this movement means moon. So it's personal, and you have to be strongly consenting. We should build on things like that. These are the gaps I see. We don't have the intellectual tools to say what is consenting in the new world. What does it mean to consent to something? And to build this idea. And what is access? What does it mean that I have the right to benefit? And it's right. I mean, we have a huge problem with the mental tsunami will be like the tsunamis of climate change. I mean, this is really coming, and we should really work that it's open to everybody. But I should not have answered, because I have specialists in the room of JESDA if you want to give them on this more question on gaps. But because I'm the hard scientist,
Thank you very much, Gerard, and actually that is what we wanted to hear from you, and we will give the floor to the colleagues. I'll just once more come back to Jonathan Andrew, because we had talked about the different areas where regulation could take place, and of course the Human Rights Council is also not existing in isolation. So Jonathan, if you can give some pointers of where you'd see also in the UN system, largely speaking, where there is inroads for that discussion, maybe also, of course, with a human rights perspective. And then we'll open to the floor to all of you, also a possibility for you on the panel to react to each other, but definitely also to the questions and additional comments coming in from the colleagues here in the room. But so just quickly over to you, Jonathan, before that.
So I think in terms of my response, I think I need to frame it also in the context of the discussion we've had thus far. And I think particularly the points made by my colleagues here on the panel around the need for a navigation tool. I also think the point brought up by Gerard regarding capacity building and education on what is a very complex topic. I think there are lots of quite esoteric and abstract concepts that, amongst many, create concerns and worries in terms of understanding what exactly we're talking about. I think one of the key points also that was mentioned earlier was around inequality, disparities. I think we saw with the COVID pandemic many assumptions made around access to healthcare, and we see even within single populations, huge disparities, inequalities. That's one of the points I think it's important to mention from my perspective in terms of privacy and data protection. It's been discussed that there are different approaches by different states. We come across the challenges of cross-boundary transfers of very sensitive data, with people's personal health data being a key issue in terms of data protection frameworks, legislation in countries differing enormously, or in some cases not even really existing in terms of data protection enforcement. So I think that's a concern. I do think, though, when we talk of navigation tools, and this touches the point of, different human rights, for example, different mandates of the independent experts, working groups, special rapporteurs within special procedures, I think it points to collaboration. It points to working together on these issues to identify the different touch points. I think what's really critical, and I've seen this with work that I did last year with the National Human Rights Institute in Denmark and with other NHRIs, when we got round the table and we talked with technology developers, we talked with civil society organizations, we're able to identify work in healthcare around issues around how data was being used, and this touches on neurotechnologies where data is being collected and analyzed, artificial intelligence is many times being applied to look for patterns in terms of, for example, we talked of functional magnetic resonance imaging. There's some really good work that's been done. I point here to the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK, which has been bringing together groups of citizens, also healthcare practitioners, technology developers, to look at how they can work together to develop systems to audit algorithms used in the development of new healthcare technologies and therapeutics. Also in terms of developing impact assessments to look at artificial intelligence. So I think it's important to see that we have tools and methodologies. We have, for example, impact assessments which have been evolved. It's an iterative process. We're seeing this already at the European level with the work the European Commission's doing on medical devices and artificial intelligence. I think it's important not to panic, see that there are, as I say, tools that exist that need to be rejigged somewhat. We have there's very much the need to have this engagement from the different parties. It's very important that we have citizens and patients involved to highlight, I think, some of the gaps and the oversights that we bring from having sometimes a very focused perspective from with each having our own individual lenses on certain challenges. I think also when we look at the methodology, and I was looking at the questionnaire, I think one of the things we see when we're looking, for example, in impact assessment is we very much focus on the needs. And I think that's one of the things we forget when we're looking at, for example, different minority groups, different parts within populations, looking at children, the elderly, people from different ethnic backgrounds. We look at the disparities in terms of the data that's collected and whether it's representative of all these different constituents within our communities. So we need to look, at applying a methodology that looks at the needs. What are we addressing with the development of these technologies? So we have the science that, it evolves into the technologies, the devices, the therapeutics, the drugs. We need to bring ourselves back to the question, because I think very much in many of these discussions, it becomes quite abstract, and there's this idea of everything and nothing. So we find ourselves going round in circles and not finding solutions. I think the key to problem solving and finding solutions is having a very focused method and approach where we look at the needs. What are we trying to address in terms of a deficiency, in terms of a cognitive impairment brought about by disease such as Alzheimer's? Follow through and then see, what are the technologies being developed? How do they meet this need? How do they address it? What are the deficiencies? What might be the oversights? And follow through in terms of engaging with the framework of human rights, understand where the touch points are, the interdependencies, the intersection across different human rights, and then identify where the impacts are, the challenges, and how we go about resolving those. And I think through doing that, we can make some progress, and that really comes to the point, I think, also of having this inclusive debate. So I think there's an awful lot of work that needs to be done in terms of capacity building, engaging policymakers, and particularly getting members of the community involved, and those with challenges, healthcare challenges, who can voice their opinions, because I think that's a key oversight I've seen in work in terms of addressing the human rights concerns of those with cognitive impairments, disabilities. How are we going to have those persons meaningfully involved? How are we going to create, for example, the mechanisms in terms of engagement and communication through online and offline to ensure they're involved and they're sat around the table? Persons who are younger, older, how are we going to involve them and ensure that their perspectives included? I think that's a key point, because that's very often been overlooked in the past.
Thank you. And so inclusive was one of the points. So we'll include definitely already as a first step all the other colleagues here in the room. I'd like to open the floor now for the discussion. We have about half an hour left for the event. I acknowledge, of course, also the presence of the representative of Greece and other colleagues from DESTA, but as I said, it's an open debate. So please, for all of you to give comments, ask questions generally, or also to specific colleagues here on the panel, please do introduce yourself when you take the floor, and also keep your intervention rather short so we can hear from many of you and also have a possibility for everyone on the panel to also react to each other's presentations and to your questions or comments. So, yes, please.
I was very interested to hear that the readings from one person are not transferable to another person. That has a systemic implication when it comes to what can be done and cannot be done with that. How far does that go? I mean, how much of it is really not transferable? And that's one question.
And sorry, could you introduce yourself?
I always forget to do that. I led mine, the One Goal Initiative for Governance. It aims to cover some risks that are not covered by the SDGs or other governance. Now, I wanted to ask also, is there any use of quantum technologies in relation to neurotech? And also I wanted to suggest that in consultations for you, to always keep in mind any affiliations, projects, dependencies, etc. of the persons who are giving the input, because they will inform their motivations.
Thank you. Well, maybe we can collect some input and then we come back to the panel. So yes, please.
Thank you, Felix, and good morning to everyone. As everyone highlighted, the future is now, and we cannot stress enough how timely this initiative has been. Happy to work with Chile on this project, that they have this international first on putting in their constitution and providing legislation on neurotechnology and human rights, and of course thanks to Dr. Trascasas for her tremendous work. I really like the presentations by Dr. Andrew and Dr. Escher. I think that there are many issues that arise, and with regard to regulation and how we proceed, of course the Human Rights Council is the framework, but I think that there we are mostly in soft law instruments, whether we're talking about a report or resolution. So I think the main question, I would say the elephant in the room, is whether we're going to have an international convention on neuro rights, or we're going to have neuro rights, or the existing human rights are sufficient to implement the neurotechnology framework. For instance, we raised the issue of privacy and mental privacy. Is the Article 19 of ICCPR the right framework? Can be implemented in this framework? And of course, there are ethical and philosophical questions, as I think Dr. Escher has raised. I mean, where the human being starts, of course, our brain is ours. But I think that these two processes, the legal one and the philosophical one, have to be done in the same time. And of course, the key issue is how to actively engage all the stakeholders. And of course, private sector is important in this, and how it's engaged. We know that there are military applications of neurotechnology already ongoing. So I think that the navigation tool and the framework that we have to set needs to be done in a comprehensive way in order to cover all these issues.
Thank you very much, Jakob. And actually, yes, it will be. I'll have a follow-up question maybe later also to you in terms of Greece's position, because the elephant in the room that you say, do we need new rights? And we had that also as a part of our discussion in our last annual conference of the Geneva Human Rights Platform. And I think Yuval Shani is one of the academic colleagues who is advocating strongly for new rights. So if you have any positioning on that you'd like to share, but maybe it's also too early in the process. Further, yes, please.
Hi, I'm Maria Wall from JESNA. I wanted to ask, normally in the day-to-day work, a neuroscientist and a human rights lawyer would never cross paths, right? So when we talk about, I mean, maybe never is too categorical, yes, but the lab people that Gerard was describing and working on the organoids, if they spend their life in an academic career, focus very, very narrowly on that, they don't know the world of the UN, they don't know what happens here in Geneva. So talking about capacity building, you've already touched upon it. How would we then build those bridges and those connections between these communities that would not normally, as part of their career development, cross each other? This is something we're very interested in fostering in system. And pardon my sometimes extreme categorical, but it is something that we see in the day-to-day with many other technologies, not just neurotech.
Thank you. Indeed, that's a big question for International Geneva, housing also experts of all sorts and how to bring them together. Indeed. Further comments for the moment? So I'll go. Oh yes, please.
Just recommend Sarah from this as well. Perhaps just building on what Margaret just said, looking at the intersection between science and diplomacy, but also adding the anticipatory outlook. When we look at the pandemic, and Dr. Andre was mentioning it, states move quickly and other stakeholders to realize that there was no mechanism in which they can, provide, greater inclusivity and access to vaccines to all regions. And we came out with COVAX, for instance, with the opportunities and, of course, the gaps that, a very quick response, let's say, to this challenge had. But if we were to look at neurotechnologies with an anticipatory outlook, and that's a good point was mentioned that you have already heard from colleagues, that there is this need to start creating a normative framework, to start the conversation even at the national level based on the experience Chile had. Are there ways in which we can accelerate this anticipatory discussion among policymakers? I was just curious about your opinions.
Thank you. I think a very important question, because you make the reference to health, and there also we see the pandemic treaty in the making, and the question that a lot of people negotiating it might pose to themselves whether it wouldn't have been better to update the global health guidelines. So actually, is that also something, a lesson to learn for the Council? And we have a number of, I think, treaty processes ongoing, from business to right to development to older persons. So we know also the time span a treaty takes. So what are practical ways? So that might also be another point you might want to comment on. Sorry, there was, yes, please.
Rastan Ibrahim, professor of human rights at State University of New York. My question is about who are the most vulnerable groups to this technology? Like, we talk about climate change that affect everyone, but some groups are affected much more than others. My question to the panelists are, whose group are the most vulnerable? The second question is about the human rights system, the Human Rights Council, the human rights system. It seems like this type of technology and AI in general also, it kind of raised a question, I think, which is partly mentioned, that who's human? And I think that question, that is a question of who's human, and whether the human rights system has the tools to give a redefinition of who's human in the future. Thank you.
Quite fundamental questions. Thank you for that. And actually, let me give it back to the panel now, and if we have maybe time for some questions then again before we close. Gerard, can we start with you? There were some rather technical questions also in the very beginning, including the one on the reading not transferable from one to another person. Is it like a technological development that we'll have in 5 years, or is it fundamentally different? So, but I let you pick from the questions that were also posed openly to everyone.
I think there are no strict technical questions. Technique is art, science is human. I mean, all this is science is part of culture. So there's no pure technical question. I think that's a wrong way. But it's a very good question, and because you get sort of opposite messages. It is true if you speak about brain states, in what state are you in, which is very important for dual use, for military applications or for day-to-day applications. There we are all similar. I know if you are angry, we can see if you are angry or if you are sleepy. You are human, and these are patterns that you can detect today with a helmet. You don't even have to, to drill a hole and to put an implant. Okay. So for global things, we are human and we react in the same way. But maybe your mother can already tell if you are angry or hungry or whatever, because we also read the faces and so forth. And so that's okay. So there is a whole technology developed really by the military in the beginning, you know, to really read the state of the person. Because a sleepy pilot will lose the plane, and that's 200 million or whatever. Okay, okay. So, but now if you go to thoughts, you know, to what do you think really, you know, I hate my neighbor. Will a machine, will a drone flying in this room pick up this thought and tell your neighbor that you don't like him, you know? So this is fantastic. This is imaginary. You can science fiction. It's not possible today. Even in the deepest neuroscience lab, we have no idea how a thought is generalizable in a brain code. No idea. You know, no idea. And our brains are messy. That's a good thing. They are built from your experience, from your history, probably from your Greek alimentation, you know, and all that stuff. That works. Okay. So we are just different at this level. So there's no problem for the next long years that these things would happen. So yes, we can read stuff, which is shared by people, but the thoughts, no. Then if we go to pathological states, one of them is trauma. So, you know, people that you have a syndrome, post-traumatic syndromes and stuff like that. We cannot read exactly the trauma, you know, what is the huge soldier that shoots you or whatever, you know, the guy who tortures you. But they are all use the same pathways in the brain. So we can stop the pathway and remove the trauma. So you can imagine that in a few years, you will have a little electrode in your brain. It's an implant, you know. And just turn it on, no trauma. Happy memories from your last war, you know. Because it's not exactly the thought that we detected, but we know that trauma always go through the same pathway. We know that already today. Today, with the technology we have, we cannot get there, really. You know, it's not possible to put something, it's very deep in the brain, it's not possible to put something in there, but that could change in 10 years. So there are also memories that belong to a class. Trauma is one class of memories that you could stop, probably in 10 years. Mm-hmm. So that's why the situation is complex, but your idea that my neighbor know what I think, no problem today. No problem. And the brain data, and the... So in this individuality at the level of thoughts, it's not a problem. So it's probably an overdone, the brain data sharing, which is behind that, can be shared brain data. That is probably something we should really look together with scientists and lawyers and the community, because it's not that problematic as you think.
Yeah, I rectify the question. My question was not you know, what I think is transferable directly to my neighbor, but it is like a use of what a third party, you know, working on this would learn how a brain functions and then apply the same knowledge to another brain. That's what we're talking about.
Yeah, okay. So the traces in the brain are different. The technologies to read the brains would be the same. So the brain waves for specific thoughts are different from one person to the next, not transferable as far as we know today, and there's no indication. But of course, the way to read this is the same for everyone.
And then if you also wanted to comment on the question of the link of quantum technology and neurotechnology, of course we've had a lot of terminologies here, and you just added one point that was not yet raised. But
this is a strange but very good question. So it's not the quantum technologies, I think, that today really interfere with neurotechnology, but it's the quantum physics. It's the understanding of the brain. And there are many indications that we actually are not yet at the right level of understanding how our brain works. And then when we understand better quantum physics, we will be much better in understanding. So we are still, you know, in a macro world, not at the quantum level. But there are many indications that when we have that, then we will look at the brain very differently. This can happen in 200 years or in 50 years, I don't know. But it's not the technologies that interfere today.
Thank you. Milena, if I come to you next, and I don't know, for example, one of the questions was how in our International Geneva we make lawyers and scientists cross paths. Maybe your work, your outreach also could be part of that, but I'll let you also pick up any of the questions you'd like.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I mean, I agree, and you were very categorical because I think this is the point. How can we work together? And in the end, what we are looking is to create, anticipate, as Gerard said, a protective framework that allows innovative technologies to continue to be developed. So I think, and of course, this links also with the need. What do we need? And this links also with the idea of the principle of equity, and non-discrimination. Because I think one of the debate would be also contradictory approaches to what we understand for what is needed at what point, and also what resources are needed for what, to develop what. And so I think, as it was mentioned, the cross-cutting principle of equity and non-discrimination will be an important point. Regarding the idea of, or what are the main groups that should be, I mean, specifically protected, we all know that our children and adolescents, because of the plasticity of their mind, it's not enough developed. So what is the impact that these technologies are going to have in their development? We can also raise questions on disabled people. We can also raise a lot of questions regarding people deprived of liberty. Are we going to use specifically in this environment or not? We have also questions on specific groups, marginalized groups, and disadvantages in economic and social issues. So are they going to be more vulnerable to be object of experiences? How can we protect? How can we avoid these possible misuses of technology? So my idea is that this has to be a connection in between all of us, because I think all of us, we are in the same line of being able to have a framework that enables a proper use of these technologies and for the proper purposes. Regarding the human, what is the, I mean, if we are going to be, after using these technologies, being still human. So I think that touch upon the core question, what's the definition of human? And this links with the idea of dignity and many other principles, autonomy. So we have to look into the impacts through the human rights framework that we have as today, the standards. What we are protecting as the essence of the human being. And I think this is the linkage in between the ethical approach that, for example, UNESCO has worked, and the human rights approach, because we are translating, or we will try to translate this into very concrete normative or principles, we don't know, that rules that could be applied by the main actors in the discussion. And last point, regarding the consent that you mentioned, and I was looking at these principles in the American Declaration on Principles on Neurotechnologies and Neuroscience that has been passed or approved by this juridical committee very recently in March 2023. And there is a principle which refers to express and informed consent, but only regarding neural data. So my concern was that I assumed that it was consent to the use of technologies, no? So I think there are many issues that would arise regarding what is non-coercive consent and what is kind of indirect coercion to use technologies. So I think these are many issues that we have to think about during the whole process.
Thank you very much. And your comment made me think also about what is human, about a presentation some years ago in a discussion on military law, around military law basically, where a colleague held a presentation saying we are all post-human because like human extension is already here in our private use. And so yes, it's not yet an implant, but actually the way we rely on that technology, she was also developing that argument. But Jonathan, I don't know if you want to answer to who is human, or if you'd rather say whether we need new rights, new e-rights on an international level, or any other of the questions.
One of the points I just think I would finish on is just that if we look at, development of, pharmaceutical devices and, medical devices and pharmaceutical products, the different actors engaged in those processes are very much forward-thinking and working to much longer timeframes than we work to in other spheres. I'm thinking in terms of 10, 15, 20-year development timeframes for some drugs or for medical devices. So in the human rights community, we need to be forward-thinking, we need to be scenario planning, we need to be bringing different stakeholders together, bringing those that are particularly impacted. We talked about marginalized groups, and you asked which I'd point to in particular. I think in terms of what we've seen from the pandemic, greater awareness of mental health challenges of many across people's lifespans. That brings us to the point where we need to think about the scenarios that we're going to face. And I think in particular, to your point, the question of agency, because I think this is a key challenge in terms of when we look at psychiatric disorders and clinical diagnoses. There are subjective diagnoses, decisions being made, and we provide in existing legal frameworks across different countries the means to intervene, to section, to take individuals from circulation in the public spheres into psychiatric wards, etc. I think, back to, from personal experience, when I've worked with people with different cognitive impairments, one of the points I was thinking on, going back to last Saturday when I worked with young people with different cognitive impairments, how do we involve them at an early stage in the process of understanding what their perspectives are, what their hopes are, what their needs are? Because we need to be very careful that we don't project our own opinions, our own beliefs in terms of what their needs are to realize their own rights. Because I find myself asking that time and again when I sit down with somebody of 13 years of age with a cognitive impairment and help them sail a boat around the lake, Lake Geneva, and then sit down with a 90-year-old who's suffering from dementia. And I find myself constantly questioning, what is it that I am projecting on another individual? And I think that's something we need to be very wary of going forward. So it's a question of agency and engagement. And it also goes back, it's education, but I think we also need to educate ourselves, those involved in policy making, about the needs of others and not be too top down.
Yeah, I can turn to you to close that discussion also. So is the Human Rights Council an anticipatory body? Is it the right place to continue that discussion? And of course, any of the questions you'd like to pick up from the audience. So over to you, Claudia.
Thank you so much. Very briefly, the issue of science and diplomacy to start with. It's really not a new issue. So diplomats have been working with scientific and with science and in communication for a long time. So for example, all the agreements related to arms control during the post-Cold War era, there are so many very interesting papers about actually how they work hand in hand, scientifics and diplomats, in different agreements specifically on issues related to nuclear and other arms control issues. So this is something that is not new. This is something that is also done in the realm of environment, of course, in which, again, diplomats and environmental science are working quite close together on several issues. So this is not something that we should be afraid of, something that we have done before, and I believe we are making steps towards that. So I think it's important also to remember that. Cooperation in Geneva, and where do we start? Lately, for some reason, I have been in many seminars and dinners and lunches dealing with issues related to technology and its challenges in different organizations that are based in Geneva. only this week, actually. I was in a conversation precisely about this with the ITU director. I was in a conversation related to that with ILO in terms of how technologies affect also the rights of the workers. There is, of course, last week, a couple of weeks ago, was the World Health Organization, once again, the issue of you know, all that have been involved in terms of the right to health and equality and access and related to technology is at the forefront of the discussion of the World Health Organization as well. So in disarmament, yes, Pamela is here also, there is super interesting discussion in terms of, you know, what do we do with artificial intelligence in context of and weapons as well, and how we use them. So all the different areas and institutions that we have in the Geneva and actually having these conversations. The problem is that they are doing that in silos. And we tend not to talk to each other. And this is a little bit repetitive. We keep saying the same thing probably in all the meetings that we have, but it's a reality. And I think in issues related to digital is probably, is where we find it you know, really it's clear what's going on. So I think some sort of initiative in terms of how we can deal with the challenges of technologies in all these different institutions in Geneva might actually help in terms of coordination and in terms of how we move forward to create, you know, so sort of path together to respond to all these many challenges that we have been discussing today. So better coordination among and how we do that among the different institutions that are based at least in Geneva to start with. And finally, the issue of rights and whether this should be new rights or not. This is a huge question. I tend to be a little bit minimalistic on this. I think we already have a Bill of Rights in place that it has been very difficult to implement, let alone having even more rights. So I think we should start by discussing how the rights that we currently have, the right to life, the right to health, the right to personal integrity, are affected somehow in relationship to the challenges of science of technology. And start from there, and how can we move forward from what the frameworks that we have and the type of implementation that we need to have in place and the type of ethical dilemmas that we need to discuss in relationship to those particular rights that we already have. And maybe from there move forward towards the future in terms of maybe new rights. But I would be a little bit more pragmatic, if you want to call it, in terms of how we move forward in the discussion when it comes to the realm of rights.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And indeed, so you show next steps, and I think that initiative to have a pan-Geneva discussion on technology is definitely one to be picked up. Also, of course, a very immediate step is the questionnaire and then the following report that you'll be doing at the advisory committee. And so I think also eventually maybe the link to JESTA's navigation tool in those discussions will be very interesting. Let me say that also here from the side of the Geneva Academy, so my colleague Erika Harper is here in the room who leads the research here in the house. We're also preparing to continue research actually on that area of neurotechnologies with the advisory committee, with Milena actually. And so I think we're also very much looking forward to continuing this debate with all of you, to have more conversations like this one, bringing again many stakeholders together and to see how to move on actually in this field, in particular, of course, as it's the specificity of the Geneva Human Rights Platform, looking at what the Human Rights Council resolutions, what the council mechanisms, the treaty bodies will develop in that field, but also then linking that up with what's going on beyond that. And as you said before, with those key terms of access, justice, equality, and consent, of course, also in mind when we look at the development of the technologies. Let me close the event here. Thank you very much again to all of the speakers for your great interventions, for all of you for your interest, and to the JESTA also for the cooperation in this event. First official cooperation of the Human Rights Platform in JESTA. I hope we'll continue on that path. And all of you also please do have a look at our newsletter to keep informed about the upcoming events that we're having, that we're organizing here at the Academy and with the platform. So thank you all, thank you very much for your interventions. Thank you and have a good rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you.